So we know the first slaves came to America in 1619. So last year, 2019, was the 400-year anniversary of the first enslaved people, first enslaved Africans. There were some indigenous people who were enslaved before this, but the first enslaved Africans to hit America's shores. And at this time, it's the British colonies in North America. And we have to remember that America has a very mixed past. So although this great story about the Pilgrims coming seeking religious freedom is very true, there's another part of this story, and this is the English colonial system. So what's the purpose of having a colony? Is to create wealth and influence for the motherland. So at the same time you have individuals who are seeking religious freedom, you also have this major system that is mining for wealth. And the way that we did it was through enslaved labor, primarily through agriculture. So for the first 150 years of slavery in America until the American Revolution, we have slaves under the British Crown bringing wealth back to Britain. Obviously, there's wealth being distributed in America. And then the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, breaking all ties with England. And we are keeping the profits now from this system for ourselves. And it's interesting to note, this is not a knock on the Founding Fathers, but Great Britain put down many a rebellion in her heyday. And the only difference between our Founding Fathers and the other rebels is that we won. Our Founding Fathers, they put everything on the line, and to their credit, but we have to remember that they were insurrectionists, and they wanted the profit. That's what they wanted. They were tired of being taxed. They were tired of sending money back, and they wanted to keep it for themselves. And the other thing, too, that we have to remember is that the racial attitudes of the day crept into the language of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights asserting that slaves are 3/5 of a human being, so not even fully human in their eyes. And this idea that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. Among these are the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What right does a slave have to pursue happiness? And the reality is these guys didn't think of slaves as being people at all. They were not part of this promise. This promise was for white European males. And it's ironic at a time where 25% of the population was enslaved. And even the Second Amendment, which is very pertinent considering all of our gun troubles today, the primary purpose of these militias was to put down slave rebellions, to make sure that we were armed and ready in case a slave rebellion were to happen. Because again, 25% of the population is black, enslaved. That's a huge number of people. And our Founding Fathers felt that they needed to defend themselves against the possibility of a rebellion. Also, it's very interesting to note the First Amendment, the right to freedom of speech and the freedom to gather and all this stuff, did not apply to slaves who were not allowed to pursue their religion. They had to do that in secret. So they were not really part of the Constitution. They were not really part of the Declaration of Independence. They were still the means of creating revenue, creating economic wealth and gain. So you move on into the United States of America, 1776, and for the next 100 years, you see these incredible abuses in the slavery. So the 250 years of chattel slavery. And just to note too, slavery it's mentioned in the Bible, but the biblical slavery was very different than the chattel slavery here. So the biblical slavery was more like indentured servitude. And because of the Jubilee year, the most you could ever be enslaved would be 50 years. After every 50 years, all debts were reset and all slaves were set free. Chattel slavery is perpetual slavery where you, your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren, all the way down the line will always be slaves. And can you imagine how depressing that is? And there's two real abuses in chattel slavery I want to point out. There's lots of them, but one is the use of torture. So, we think it was guns and chains and fences maybe that kept slaves on plantations, but it really wasn't any of these things. It was the way that they would torture a runaway slave. If a runaway slave was ever captured, they would torture that slave horrendously in front of the other slaves to prove a point that you would never run away from your master. And this was hammered home. There were slave patrols constantly patrolling for runaway slaves. It was just a horrible use of terror. It was really a system of terror in order to grease the wheels of chattel slavery. The other one is the rampant sexual assault on slaves, both from slave owners and from male slaves. They would pick the biggest, strongest male slaves and literally breed them. It was like a breeding program. And then a lot of slave owners would have sex with their female slaves and have children that were sadly born into slavery. So if you're a white free man and you have a child with a black slave, your child and down to 3 generations would have been a slave, because it was ruled by the Supreme Court that if you are 1/8 black, you are black. So these white owners, slave owners, would literally have their own children. So they were selling them into perpetual slavery. When Europeans would come to America in the colonial days, they were very surprised at the amount of mulattoes, the amount of mixed slaves that were here. It was shocking to them. It was a horrible, horrible abuse. The sexual abuse is a constant fear of being sexually abused for the female slaves, really expected. And where the rubber hits the road with the church is that every single person in the church, every citizen would have known about these abuses and probably has seen them firsthand. And the church not only allowed these abuses to happen, they promulgated them. There was 2 major theologies that the church used to perpetuate the wicked institution of slavery. The first one is called the curse of Ham. It's actually the curse of Canaan. It was when Noah's nakedness was uncovered and he cursed Ham's son Canaan. And what the white preachers would say is that Canaan, his descendants were black, and that every black person had a curse on their lives and that they deserved to be enslaved, even though Jesus Christ broke the curse on the tree when he became a curse for us. The second major theology that was preached during slavery, and this carried on into Jim Crow, although the curse of Ham did not, was the Tower of Babel, and how all people were dispersed across the face of the earth and given different languages and different ethnic groups. And the idea was that we were meant to be separate, even though that was undone at the day of Pentecost, when all those languages came back together at the beginning of the church. Every tribe and tongue worshiping before the throne of God and the Lamb, and no Jew, no Gentile, no Greek, no Hellenist, no slave nor free, no male nor female in Christ Jesus. We're all one. These 2 theologies were preached, and sadly, I remember reading quotes from these preachers at the advent of the Civil War. And they were on the front lines preaching that this was a holy war, that we were called to defend this godly way of life, and adamantly spurring the Confederate troops on. These were the men of God of the day. And if the men of God are preaching this wickedness, how can the people, how can the sheep who are following the shepherd know any better? And the sad thing about this very, very avid belief that slavery was right, that it was God's ordained order, propelled us into this season of Jim Crow, which is my next video. And there should be a link that's about to pop up if you want to continue to watch that. I appreciate your time. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.